The title of your article, I emotionally abused my ex. So that's pretty intense. And it's something, it's probably quite extreme for a lot of people because you've got the word abuse in there, emotional abuse. And I think especially in the year that we had in 2022 with what we saw with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, that's a red flag for people. Is that because you were trying to change your partner and you were kind of hating yourself for it, or trying to be accountable for your own part of it?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of interesting questions in there. I think abuse is a lot more common than we realize. I also think that trauma is a lot more common than we realize. I think everybody has moments in relationships, really in every relationship in their lives, in which they're in some ways kind of abusive. And that it's almost like a degree of, and not, I think with physical abuse there's like a pretty clear demarcation, like did you or did you not physically attack this person. With emotional abuse, it can be a lot harder to understand where the line is between just bad behavior and abusive behavior, but I'm not necessarily sure there is a line. That when we come to a point of like antagonizing somebody and blaming them for our pain and acting in ways that we know are going to hurt them, or that, whether or not our intention is to hurt them, we're still willingly causing this person pain and knowingly causing someone pain. I think it's fair to call that abuse, that there's a reason that relationships hurt us so much. And it's not that we're crazy. It's not that we're overly sensitive. It's that relationships can be profoundly painful and riddled with all kinds of abuse. And we can be self-abusive in our relationships. I've certainly had relationships that inspired me to abuse myself. I've had relationships in which I felt actively abused by my partners. And this was sort of the first time I've had a relationship where I can look back on it and say, I had more power than the other person, which I think is a critical part of the equation. And when we don't talk about a lot with abuse, but we're starting to with like Me Too, that like these power differentials create the capacity for abuse because you do have more power to respond to your needs than the other person does. You do have more power to change the relationship and set the tone than the other person does. And when that power is too inequitable, the possibility of consent is sort of done away with. We all understand that like a 6-year-old cannot consent to have sex with her teacher. There's too big of a power dynamic. If I put a gun to your head and say, give me all your money, and you do it, you didn't really consent. And so I think it's really easy to become an abuser when you're in a position of having more power than your partner or than anybody they're in a relationship with. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you can have that only somebody with more power can be abusive, but there is like an added layer of responsibility that comes with having more power. And that what ordinarily might be a mutually abusive dynamic or a dynamic of just kind of toxicity and incompatibility and causing each other a lot of pain and fighting a lot. And when you add in that power dynamic, because in this case, I was with a partner that I had a lot more money than, that we were a lot of times like with my family and on my turf and kind of living my life, like he very much joined me in my world and didn't really fit, and my response to that was a lot of times to be a total bitch, or to blame him or to manipulate him in ways that looking back on that, I think, wow, I did to him what I have had done to me. And so when I wrote about self-flagellation versus accountability, I think it was more a question of what is the response, because that essay was very much not just about having been abusive, but sitting with having been abusive and the experience of being like, okay, what do I do now that I recognize that I've done this? And we see a lot of content out there about how to heal from being abused, but I have hardly ever seen anyone talk about how to heal from being abusive. And so it can easily, the attempts to kind of publicly voice accountability and say, and I've privately voiced accountability with him as well many times. And before I published this article, sent a very thorough letter detailing specific events that I didn't get into because I just felt like that was kind of a violation of his privacy too. But specific actions I took that I was like, I apologize for this. I shouldn't have done that. But to write about it in public, it felt important to me to kind of share the lessons I learned from my healing process with people, but that it could very easily be almost like performative guilt, to be like, whip myself on the back, like, forgive me, everyone. I'm so horrible. I've abused someone. Oh my God. And it's like, that is not genuine accountability. Genuine accountability is not a deep self-loathing, and saying like, oh my God, I'm so terrible. We all know how awful it is when you're like fighting with a partner and you're trying to explain to them what they did wrong. And they're like, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. And finally they're like, yeah, I'm just so terrible. And I'm the worst person ever. And oh my God. And you're like, that's not helpful either. That's still all about you, And so I think in recognizing that we have done wrong, because I've seen some articles around this and just discussions around this, not necessarily in article form, around the Me Too movement of men saying, I did that too, not just it happened to me, but I was an aggressor too. I see how I was a part of the problem. And I think that kind of content is tremendously valuable, because the solution to abuse is not just for abuse victims and abuse survivors to heal, but for abusers to heal so that we're no longer abusers. And understanding, how did I get to this point where I was abusive to someone? Why did it happen? What were the ingredients? What were the erroneous notions in my head that led to this? Yeah, felt just like so important to walk through the steps, and weird to do so in public, definitely, and kind of intense to do so in public in ways that I'm like, like a lot of people I know have access to reading this, and this is pretty intimate. But yeah, it just felt too important to tell the story of what it's like to have been an abuser and to recognize that and try and heal from it.
How are you reconciling with it now?
I think steadily and with like a lot of mindfulness. I don't think that it feels weird to be like, I'm over it. Like I'm not. I think that I'm very aware of the reasons why I ended up feeling, in this state of like needing to act in ways that were abusive, that so much of it was about being very, very unhappy in the relationship and believing that he could change that for me. And that I think the main thing I've learned and have been actively practicing, even though I'm not in a partnership right now, but just in all of my relationships, be they romantic or platonic, is recognizing that like this other person is not the source of my pain. And this other person is also not the cure for it. And that, I'm the one who chooses how I feel. And the more I practice that, the truer it becomes. And, writing this, I was left in this space of like, I want the lesson now to be, I've healed and it will never happen again, and this is never, and I think we have a desire when we encounter stories of people having been abusive to hear them say, and it will never ever happen again. Because we want to believe that it is that simple. But the fact is, if it happened once, there were conditions that can cause it. And if it could happen to somebody who has been the victim of emotional abuse too, who's to say that it can't happen again? And who's to say that it can't happen to you or anybody? And I think that's a deeply uncomfortable thing for people to be like, oh, we actually can't guarantee that this won't happen. We can just keep learning. So I think that's kind of where I'm at with it.
So speaking of, so you were talking about ingredients. I
can't hear him.
You can't?
Hi, baby.
Can you see him?
Babe, I can see him now, yes. He's such a babe.
I know. He is. Okay, so you were talking about ingredients into kind of what fed into you getting to the state where you felt like you felt in that situation. And you actually write about it in your article. So you say, to make an abuser, the most essential ingredient is misery. Can you talk a bit about that? Or yeah.
Happily. I'll happily talk about misery. We abuse people because we're unhappy. Like, it's really that simple. And that's not there are other ingredients that it takes. But, it's that classic trope of hurt people. And not everyone who has been hurt will hurt people, but you don't hurt others unless you are hurting. Full stop.
I heard a great quote in a book called Boundaries, and then it says, even the abuser is abused if the abuse is allowed to continue.
And it's because like the kind of the next ingredient I talk is about in the article is like the misplaced fault for that misery, the misplaced who can fix it, of thinking I'm miserable and it's because you're acting like this right now. Well, no, it's not. I'm miserable because of things that have really nothing to do with you, and maybe your actions are contributing to them, but you don't actually need to change anything in order for me to be happy. And like that, returning that internal locus of control over our happiness is something that if we allow that abuse to perpetuate, we're robbed of, because we're going to just continue on believing in the illusion that this other person can take away our misery, and they can't. And we're just going to stay miserable. And it's going to hurt us as well.